Welcome to the Lyster Health Talks podcast. Listen in as the team focuses on relevant, relatable health content that empowers your health and the readiness of the force. We are officially clearing the runway for a special mini-series dedicated entirely to aviation medicine. Over the next few episodes, we're diving into the critical role aviation medicine plays in keeping our pilots and crews mission ready and showing you exactly how our care keeps you in the air. Let's prep for takeoff as we talk aviation medicine here at Fort Rucker, the home of Army Aviation.
Welcome to the Aviation Medicine mini-series. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Leah Steder, the Director and Commander of Lyster Army Health Clinic and the host of the Lyster Health Talks podcast. Too often, conversations about mental health are surrounded by misconceptions, uncertainty, or concerns about career impact. The reality is that maintaining psychological health is just as important as maintaining physical health. In today's episode, we'll discuss common stressors facing aviators, when to seek help, and how aviation psychology helps keep our force healthy, resilient, and mission ready. I'm joined by two of our experts in this arena. I'm joined by our Deputy Commander of Clinical Services, who also happens to be our aeromedical psychologist, Major Daniella Pettinari. Welcome back to the series. And we have a special treat today. We're joined by the Sergeant Major of Lyster, Garret Cleland, whose specialty in the military happens to be a mental health technician. So welcome.
Thanks for having us.
And I know, Sergeant Major Cleland, can you talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions that might be out there about seeking behavioral health?
So this is one of the struggles in the Army. You hear everyone talk about stigma and the dangers of seeking mental health. Of course, there are different processes that mental health can relate to in your career, whether it relates to your security clearance, profiles, medications, things of that nature. But really, when we're looking at the aviation standpoint, there's more risk associated with not seeking help than there is with the process of seeking the help that's needed. And ma'am, from your standpoint, Major Pettinari, can you talk about some of the challenges and how it relates to not seeking treatment when working with a flight status and things like flight physicals?
Yeah, from an aeromedical psychologist's perspective, what we're really looking at is risk. And so I'll tell a little short story here, just in terms of my personal experience. At my last duty station, I decided I was going to pursue a private pilot's license. And so I started flying a Piper Cherokee. And one of the things that surprised me the most in my flying journey was the amount of cognitive power required to fly an aircraft. And it completely changed the way that I looked at aeromedical psychology, because at the end of the day, our goal is to keep aviators in the air, but also be mindful of the risk involved in flying. When somebody experiences stress or sleep deprivation, that impacts cognitive power. And so we may see a decline in attention. We may see decline in processing speed. We may see decline in working memory. So essentially being able to remember the information that's communicated to you over the radio. And so we're constantly having to multitask in the aircraft. And so it's incredibly important to make sure from a mental health perspective that we're taking care of ourselves and really ensuring that before we get into the aircraft, we are performing at our best. Did I answer your question?
You did, ma'am. And to just follow up on that, so something that I've always heard when it relates to mental health and your wellness is looking at your oil. So it's essentially your occupational, your interpersonal, and your leisure activities, and figuring out when you cross the threshold into something that's problematic. So, ma'am, with resiliency being on a spectrum and everybody being different with how they react to common stressors, when do you feel like the appropriate level is for someone to seek treatment for a problem that they're experiencing?
My recommendation is to take a prevention mindset. So when you first start noticing, hey, something's not quite right, hey, the last few days I haven't been getting sufficient sleep, if your built-in coping strategies, healthy coping strategies, are not working, I would encourage somebody at that point to seek additional resources. I think the biggest misconception when it comes to psychology or mental health and aviation is that if I see behavioral health, I will never fly again. And that's really not the case at all. There are plenty of people who are on flight status and also seeking therapy. When it becomes a problem and a service member gets grounded is when symptoms have gotten so severe that they're difficult to manage on your own. And at that point, then we're really looking at the risk of flying.
Thank you for that discussion from both of you. I mean, it's well known that aviators often carry the most precious cargo, so it's incredibly important that they are at the top of their game. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about more what a normal life stressor is versus a mental health condition that somebody should seek help for?
The way that I like to differentiate that is when it comes to functioning. So when somebody is experiencing a normal life stressor, they're still able to go through their day, maintain their relationships. You don't see occupational impairment. They're maybe just having a bad day, essentially. When it becomes a mental health concern is when functioning becomes impaired. And so when we think about impairment, it's whether you're just not able to do your job, it's impacting the way that you do your job. It's impacting relationships. Relationships are becoming problematic, or there's other areas in one's life where it's just difficult. So maybe you are used to getting up at 6 a.m. and rolling through your day, and every day that's becoming harder and harder. And so maybe you're sleeping in. Maybe you start forgetting things at work. Major tasks that typically you have been able to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. So from a behavioral health perspective, we're really looking at the functioning of an individual. Your general day-to-day stressors aren't necessarily going to cause significant impairment. Everybody reacts different to stress. If you are having a bad day and something is off and you're supposed to fly, I would come up on the net and be saying something to your leadership, because any distraction can impact flight. And I think that's the ability to recognize that and then do something about it is one of the best things you can do to protect yourself and the people in your aircraft.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you did mention come up on the net with your leaders. What are some things that leaders can do to create an environment where their folks feel comfortable seeking help and they see it more as a strength than a weakness?
So from my perspective, I think this is finding the balance, because if you have a subordinate that comes to you and they say, hey, I don't feel comfortable flying today because I'm dealing with these things, you have to figure out what the balance is as a leader between making sure that that person has the resources and the time they need to take care of themselves, while also maintaining the safety parameters associated with flying. So I don't think that there's, one size fits all for each leader in a specific environment, but I think it's about knowing your people.
I think that's a great point, Sergeant Major. I really think it's important for leaders at all levels to know their people. I think sometimes we just get caught up in the daily grind of what we have to do, that sometimes we forget the human element of our formation. There's task after task, mission requirement after mission requirement, and it can be really easy to get so focused on that we forget sometimes to check in our people, to maybe, I might notice, hey, there's something not quite right going on with you, but instead of pulling you aside and being like, hey, are you doing okay today? I get so caught up in my task, right, that I'm supposed to do. And I think if we can place more emphasis on the human side, we would be better at intervening.
I think that's why it's so important to be present as a leader, because if you lead via email, you're not going to be able to see the eyes of the person that you're talking to and understand if something's different or if they look different than your normal interactions with them. And that's really how you at the ground level, determine if there's concern, risk, or additional support that's needed.
Yes, our major always says don't be a closed door leader.
I do say that all the time.
Open the door and make sure you know your people.
No, those are both great points, and I do want to circle back a little bit. So leaders need to routinely communicate, and I know the stigma has been there for years that if you seek behavioral health, you will get grounded, and you've mentioned it several times today that is not the case. We've mentioned in other podcasts that the reality is the flight surgeon and the aero medicine psychologist want to find ways to keep folks up.
I know we've talked a lot about stigma, and I know there is stigma when it comes to aviation specifically. But the reality is that, one, if you seek mental health services and you don't meet a diagnosis, a major mental health diagnosis, then you're likely going to remain on flight status. If you do meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis, you will likely be temporarily grounded. My expectation is that folks would go through a trial of treatment. And generally speaking, what we see is once people go through treatment and demonstrate improvement, they're going to get back up in the air. It's very far and few between that I ground somebody permanently unless there is some serious mental health illness going on. And so I would just encourage people that if something's feeling off, get the help you need early, because oftentimes treatment will be shorter.
We have a multitude of listeners on here. A lot of them are new folks that are trying to join Army Aviation. Can you talk a little bit about it? Was it imperative for them to know when it pertains to talking a little bit about any past mental health experiences?
What I'll highlight off of that is, and I know I've spoke about it in other podcasts, with our new Genesis system, we can see historical records. And one of the things I see when I do initial flight physicals or aeromed psych evaluations is that folks will omit information because it's no longer relevant. So, for example, I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 7 years old. I was prescribed medication. I stopped taking medication when I was 10 years old. ADHD is no longer an issue, so I'm not going to disclose it. As a provider, I can go into Genesis and I can see that you were prescribed ADHD medication, have a diagnosis of ADHD, and from a flight perspective, that is absolutely relevant. And it's going to dictate what we do in terms of the assessment. And so I would just ask that folks, even if you don't think it's relevant, please don't omit it and be forthcoming in terms of discussing the entirety of your medical record, both physical medicine and mental health, because we can see it.
You know, but before we wrap up today, is there any other myths that you'd like to dispel for our listeners?
The only other thing I would want to add is related to mental health medications. And an individual on flight status can be prescribed certain psychiatric medications. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll never be able to fly again. What would happen is once that service member is prescribed medication, they would be placed on a down slip temporarily until they were able to reach a period of stability. So when we were looking for about a 3 to 4 month period of stability on a medication and dose, and once they've reached that therapeutic dose, we would then conduct an aeromed psych evaluation and get them back up in the air. But just because you're on a medication, just because somebody recommends a medication doesn't mean that you'll never be able to fly again. It would essentially lead to a temporary downslip and then a reevaluation to get back up in the air.
I just want to add into that just ensure if to our listeners that if you are given a medication and your flight surgeon or aeromed psychologist does not know about it, please make sure that you let them know.
Yes, so if you get prescribed any medication from somebody on the outside of a MTF, please, regardless of what medication, whether it's a mental health medication or not, please inform your flight surgeon.
Before we close out today, what is one thing you'd want every aviator to know?
Personally, I would just say, just like you have rest cycles that you need in order to fly, you also need that for your mind too, to make sure that you are in optimal performance mode to be able to do what you need to do when you're in the cockpit. As Major Pettinari said, being forthcoming with information is truly important. It's much better to be forward about the information or challenges that you're having than deal with something negative on the back end because you didn't get the proper treatment that you needed whenever you needed it.
I agree 100% with Sergeant Major. What I'll add to that is when it comes to coping, establish healthy coping skills. Practice them when you're not stressed out, because if you don't practice them when you're not stressed out, you're likely not going to implement them when you are stressed out. And we tend to revert back to unhealthy coping styles. One of the most classic coping skills is deep breathing. And so, for example, when I sit with folks, I encourage them to practice deep breathing 3 times a day, any time of the day, for at least 1 minute. You have to practice coping in low-threat situations so that when you get to high-threat situations, you're more likely to implement.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next time, stay healthy, stay resilient, and stay mission ready.
And that wraps up another episode of our Aviation Medicine mini-series on Lyster Health Talks. Stay healthy, Fort Rucker.